It's a great honour for me to be in this incredible and very, very appropriate environment. It must be the grandest one I've ever had the honour to speak in. But I'm not going to start with something very grand, but something rather personal. On the Monday, the 11th of March, 1935, John Maynard Keynes reported to his wife Lydia, "I had to lunch today the fellowship candidate who seems much the cleverest on paper to inspect him and his fingernails. He is excellent. There cannot be a shadow of doubt about it. His fingernails are as long as yours. In proportion, it is infallible. And he was very nice. Turing, his name." And Maynard Keynes then proposed Turing for election as a fellowship, as you may have seen in the exhibition. And these are photos of Keynes and Alan Turing at about that time. The picture of Turing's just a street photo snapshot of that period, showing what he looked like in ordinary life rather than one of the more posed portraits. The Maynard Keynes fingernail test was a serious one. Maynard Keynes took against the poet W.H. Auden, for instance, who, despite other splendid characteristics, had very badly bitten nails. And the remarkable thing about this story is that Turing himself, later in his life, certainly did have dirty and bitten nails, which people complained about. So it was by the skin of his teeth, or rather by keeping his teeth off his nails, that he was elected to this wonderful college. And as people said, Turing must have been alluring to get made a Don so early on. He was only 22 at the time, and Maynard Keynes was 51. And this vignette shows how hard it is to separate questions of personality, sexuality, and pure chance from those of intellectual achievement. Now, Alan Turing didn't leave a lot about himself in diaries or letters, so we don't see the other side of this encounter, as you may have seen from the archive. I mean, compared with a bulging Keynes archive, the Turing corpus is pretty skinny. But there's one point where the 17-year-old Alan Turing left a most expressive testament, and like rich archaeological hoards, it stems from a disaster. This was the sudden death in February 1930 of Christopher Morcom, a boy at Turing's school whom he'd fallen in love with, entirely unrequited. And although a great classic public school story, this was bound up with Cambridge because their closest approach had been when they both sat the scholarship examinations, actually at Trinity College. Turing failed that, didn't get a scholarship, and stayed on at school another year, this time successfully applying for a scholarship at King's and starting in 1931, and so that's how he came to King's. There's another picture here. This is a picture of Christopher Morcom on the left, and on the right is a remarkable piece of writing by the young Alan Turing in about 1932. The thing is that once Turing came to Cambridge, he had no more trouble with exams. He got on like a house on fire with serious mathematical work. But the experience of this first love and the sudden death affected him profoundly for his undergraduate years, and indeed for, I think, his whole life. His reading went well ahead of this Cambridge syllabus from the start, and it was propelled both in content and seriousness by the inspiration of the dead boy. Science and sexuality were mixed up in this process, and in this essay, which was actually written for the dead boy's mother, he tentatively suggested a role for quantum mechanics in the working of the brain, with a romantic hope that he could give scientific meaning to spiritual survival after physical death. One document that hasn't survived is the diary of his feelings that he showed to his fellow King's math scholar David Champernowne. And in one way, of course, he was fortunate. No environment in the English-speaking world could, very discreetly, have been so supportive of same-sex passion as the one that he found in this college. And this was pure good luck. He could have had no idea when applying to King's, whose wonderful chapel and broadcast carol service no doubt enthralled his mother, but that wasn't quite Alan Turing's thing, but he wouldn't have known that it held any such prospects for him. On the other hand, bad luck also played his part. If we're looking at the whole of his world now at King's, there was a third maths scholar in his year, James Atkins. James was serious, very bright, very individual-minded, and he went walking with Alan in the Lake District after the 1933 exams. There was a classic incident which could have come from one of E.M. Forster's suppressed stories, which led to a relationship which continued for several years. But James was more attracted to Alan Turing than the other way round, and somehow they deepened a mutual gloom rather than lightened each other's lives. And I call this bad luck because it was. I mean, a slightly different person might have become a lifelong partner, and the whole of the story might have been entirely different. And this is what life is like. And generally speaking, Alan Turing was not happy in the 1930s about being homosexual, a word he must have accepted during this period, for reasons which, of course, were far from being his alone. Could it ever lead to stability or satisfaction? Would he ever find mutual love? Would he always be alone, always cut off? And all of this tied up with the intense, eccentrically abusive public school experience which had the upper middle classes so totally in its imperial grip. Anyway, this brings us back to that meeting in 1935 and what he and Maynard Keynes might have talked about over that lunch while Maynard Keynes was examining the fingernails. There were deep questions that they shared. How to manage erotic need, how to find love. Was there a viable life for a homosexual man? But even deeper, back in 1930, Alan Turing had used a hackneyed yet entirely genuine expression of commitment to do something that the dead boy could no longer do. Not just to think or to see or even discover, but to do. And this was a theme that pervaded his life, even though he was certainly not a natural person of action. How to do something in the world when at odds with that world, an outlaw in many ways. Maynard Keynes himself was unique in the Bloomsbury world for being more than a thinker. He had taken serious responsibility for political action in the First World War and its aftermath, and he, as much as anyone, had trod this very dangerous line with enormous verve. Well, I doubt very much whether any such conversation took place. I mean, Maynard Keynes would hardly have revealed himself, and nor did Turing follow anyone from an older generation. He did not cultivate influential figures. He never dropped Keynes's name, for instance, and he did not dine much at high table. He stayed with his own young cohort in which new winds of communism, anti-fascism were blowing after 1933. And my impression is that Turing's circle had to work things out for themselves and didn't take advice from those who saw as the old fogies, although there's certainly some incidents in Turing's life seem right out of an Edwardian novel. More likely, in response to Keynes's prompting, Turing spoke very impressively of what he was doing, and which was a fresh breeze in the mathematical sciences. 1935, just the time of this lunch meeting, was the moment when he took off as a world-leading figure. His fellowship thesis was, in probability, one area that was accessible to Keynes, and as someone schooled in mathematics but who had rejected doing pure mathematics for its own sake, Keynes would have warmed to Turing's unusually wide interests, not just in mathematics, but in philosophy and fundamental science, inspired in many ways by the Morecambe legacy that I've described to you with this letter, and which in March 1935 were just about to find expression. Of course, Maynard Keynes himself at this point was just about to publish his own major work, Modern Economic Theory, which would influence the next 40 years. So this was a remarkable meeting of minds. Now, in a more conventional computer science talk, I would explain more of Alan Turing's great 1936 paper. And yet, actually, it would revolve around the same conjunction of thinking and doing that I've already emphasized in the psychology. Computing involves the software or algorithms which are products of thought, very like mathematics, symbolic. But unlike mathematics, computing involves implementing those algorithms in actual physical engineered objects, the hardware. Alan Turing in 1936 mapped out that new, unexplored, hitherto unexplored world, undefined world of software, of programming. He also discovered the idea that it would be enough to make a single machine, the universal machine, which could be used to implement any algorithm. And that's Alan Turing in 1936, looking very pleased with himself, as he might well be. That's the heading of his famous paper, with its very memorable, snappy title, which you may notice. But what he did have as a snappy title was this very important expression: it is possible to invent a single machine called the universal machine. And that's the thing which runs through the story. It is the story of the computer. Turing in 1936 made no indication of how such a machine could be made in hardware, and the necessary technology didn't exist for another decade. When it did, his life became bound up with it. Driven as he was by the urge not only to think but to do, he probably got too much involved in it. In those early days of computers, the hardware engineers of the physical machines were seen as their creators, and softy Turing got short shrift. Nowadays, the physical computers are two a penny. You needn't know anything at all about the little chips that are going on inside your iPhone, and we're much, much closer now to Turing's 1936 world, in which the extent and power of software is all-consuming. How could Turing imagine in 1936 the world in which we now live in this digital world? He was able to do this because he combined a new analysis of thinking with a vision of doing, which was perhaps drawn from that 1930s world of teleprinters and the assembly line. Turing's discussion of mental processes became more and more ambitious as time went on, and it was a scientific demystification of mind, prefigured in that essay for Christopher Morcom's mother, but anticipating his later projection of artificial intelligence, which is now so much been in the news. It's not surprising that in parallel, he was in tune with the modernizers who were trying to demystify sexuality. And that parallel gives me a little theme for this talk, which I was asked to talk about on a computing subject, but related to gender and sexuality. And I will try not to overemphasize any parallel here, but to draw attention to the great trend of modernizing of thought which went on during the middle of the 20th century. Well, as Maynard Keynes might provocatively have said, Turing's modernization, with his explicitness, his way of thinking about thinking, explicitness and emphasis on mechanical operation, sounded like Americanization. And indeed, the cultural pull of the United States was visible even then. Turing was not someone who saw America as his future life, though his father probably did. His father was an Indian civil servant who had come to the conclusion the British Empire was finished. But he didn't take that view. He was very much always stuck to this country. But there's no question that the world of mathematical logic, like quantum physics, had shifted to America, accelerated, of course, by Hitler. Turing's work hitherto had rested mainly on German-led mathematics, but for the next step, he was off to Princeton in the United States. On the boat, Turing noted in terms that could have come straight from Maynard Keynes's lunch table that Americans can be the most insufferable and insensitive creatures that you could wish. The word insensitive strikes rather a serious chord here. Turing liked explicit, plain speaking, but also sensitivity. And this is a contradiction. It's hard to combine directness with nuanced empathy, but it is the contradiction of being a real human being. He didn't like American social conformity and small talk, probably redolent of his mother's fussy Guildford tea parties. For dialogue he did like, he took his volume of Bernard Shaw's plays with him to America. And here's a picture of him at Princeton in 1937, another snapshot which is caught unawares, and rather tellingly, he's sort of a bit off to the side, both looking to the side and off the side of the picture, and that's not a bad image of the way that the way he carried on. Now, well, he works away very hard, and I'm not going to talk about his pure mathematical work, though it was of the highest level, but point out how personal and moral themes developed in this exile setting. Almost as soon as he was there, he noticed an application of his new world of algorithms into what we would now call secure cryptography. Now, he immediately saw this as a moral question about what to do, and also posed it as a practical question relevant to likely war with Germany, even then in 1936. That word application, going from soft idea to hard action, thinking and doing, logic to physics, for him, this was very close to erotic. He was not skilled with his hands, but he loved the idea of concrete application. And indeed, this was rather closely related to his pattern of romantic attraction. He had rather a soft spot for two particular types of men. One were wan, lost boys, and the second type were hands-on, confident, practical guys. And at Princeton, Morris Price, who was a handsome physics graduate in his group of English students, fitted the second type to a T. Alan recalled him as his chief flame when, in 1951, they later became Fellows of the Royal Society together. That flame had been hot enough to burn, and there is very good reason, which I'll come back to later, that in 1937 he might very well have suffered considerable depression as yet another prolonged and unrequited desire went completely unfulfilled and unanswered. Also interesting, in late 1936, there was another Anglo-American story which roused his modernizing zeal. The American newspapers broke what was still a British taboo and got early news of the crisis around Edward VIII. Alan Turing was absolutely on the king's side. As for the Archbishop of Canterbury, he wrote, "I consider his behavior disgraceful." These were exactly the same as Maynard Keynes's views as he described the Archbishop to Lydia as oozing humbug. But there was an extra point which Turing made away in America. He was willing to change his opinion when the facts changed. He heard that the king had been careless with state papers and allowed Mrs. Simpson to see them. And this was very prophetic. He saw that national security commitments had to take priority over personal freedom, however much he valued the modern sense of personal freedom that the issue brought up. As war loomed, 1938 meant the moral choice for him involved the question of national security. Again, a choice between thinking, pure thinking, as he could have done, and doing as he was going to do, innocence and experience, not unlike the choice that Maynard Keynes had made in 1914, and again, despite his illness, in 1939. And this was a very real choice. Alan Turing turns down a very good postdoc offer at Princeton. Instead, he returned here to King's and joins the forerunner of GCHQ in 1938. This was a pretty seamless transition from King's, and he would have sensed that the older code breakers, those who'd served in the First World War and continued, they were typically Edwardian confidants of Maynard Keynes's circle, and the whole thing was like a continuation of the senior common room at the college here. But Turing's recruitment did make one notable change, and it marked a turning point. This department was for the first time recruiting mathematicians because of the challenge of the now famous German Enigma machine. So Alan Turing did not need to push. This was an open door. And it must have been very exciting to be let into the British government's most secret department. But just as important to him in 1939 was another German-related development. Together with Fred Clayton, a classics fellow from this college, but his own group, he sponsored a refugee boy, Robert, from Nazi Germany. This was very much Fred's suggestion, but Alan was very keen on the idea and also contributed to helping Robert throughout the war. And this is a very remarkable photograph taken at Bosham in Sussex, where they took the boys on boating. There's Alan at the front, and the two boys in between, and Fred Clayton, Alan's friend, at the back. And most of all, because of the timing of this. You cannot see, but this was the last week of peace. It was the week of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, when war became inevitable. These boys would never see their families again. And who would ever have guessed that the figure at the front, a not terribly expert boats guy, was going to be the most important person as an individual person in the war that was looming up. But that is what happened. And immediately after that photograph, war began, and Alan Turing moved to now famous Bletchley Park. He soon wrote to John Shepherd, the Provost of King's then, referring to the older codebreaker Dilwyn Knox as my boss. And I have no idea whether he knew of the relationships of the previous era between Shepherd and Keynes, let alone that Knox had been Keynes's first boyfriend at Eton. But he did, I think, sense that he was at a home from home. And it was a home that worked a miracle. Turing came up with a very ingenious algorithm, greatly extending the ideas that Polish mathematicians had contributed, which led to the regular mechanical decoding of a swathe of Enigma messages. This idea, combined very effectively with the contribution of another mathematician, Gordon Welchman, was immediately accepted by the establishment, and as early as November 1939 was being implemented at enormous expense in hardware. The first such machine, the bomb, was actually working before Churchill became Prime Minister. This amazing experience must have given him a rather over rosy idea of how easy it would be to get revolutionary modernization accepted and implemented. And this was not all he did. I mean, it's just the start. His new ideas and statistics followed, turning guessing into algorithms performing explicit calculations, material which is the forerunner of the statistical methods used in artificial intelligence and other advanced applications now. In spring 1941, Alan Turing was in charge of the U-boat communications war and applying algorithms with great success, and he had a number of mathematical assistants. One of these was Joan Clark, a Newnham graduate student supervised by Gordon Welchman, actually sister of another fellow of this college. And now here was a script which could have been taken from a generation before, in which hitherto homosexual dons found safe marriages in just such networks of knowledge and friendship. But it was more than that. It was a real pleasure in friendship. Alan Turing did propose marriage, but then immediately said that it might not be possible. He had homosexual tendencies. Revealingly, he spoke a good deal of the refugee, Robert, and gave her Fred Clayton's autobiographical novel as a way of describing and explaining those tendencies. And it seems likely to me that one reason he made this attempt at heterosexuality was his awareness of the dangerous direction that the refugee sponsorship was leading his emotions. But anyway, it didn't work. After a week's holiday in Wales, he broke it off. And of course, she was very upset, but not entirely surprised. As she put it, there had not been much physical contact, and the week away probably crystallized the impossibility of there being any more. He quoted to her from Oscar Wilde, "For each man kills the thing he loves." And this shows, I think, an Alan Turing who was able to combine explicitness and directness, but also great sensitivity when he chose to do so. As GCHQ's envoy to the United States in 1942, Turing also needed considerable diplomacy there too. He had to oversee the transfer of Enigma technology to the United States to match the scale of the Battle of the Atlantic, but also to vet American developments on behalf of the ever less influential British government. And this is one of the machines he saw being built in Ohio, which was his westernmost point of his life. This is an American-built bomb. You may notice that the placement of the female operator by the machine prefigures a great deal that's common to the whole information technology in succeeding decades. But I think you will also know that that was not the whole story, and the story of Joan Clark is an illustration of how that was far from being the only way in which women were involved in the new technology in its beginnings. Anyway, this required negotiating special British access to American secrets at a time when American government departments would hardly speak to each other, something very close to Maynard Keynes's experience in both wars, and it's really striking. Just a few years after that lunchtime conversation and nail inspection, Maynard Keynes was founding the post-war financial system, and Alan Turing, the underlying structure of the post-war Anglo-American intelligence sharing. But this, I must say, was not his sort of thing at all, and might well have led to a great deal of nail-biting on the terrifying Atlantic crossings at the height of the Battle of the Atlantic, which was what he had to do. Well, what was his sort of thing? His sort of thing was seeing a new thought turned into physical implementation. He came back from America learning electronics and very shortly devised an advanced speech encipherment system, specifically to do better than the American system. He characterized American technology as using a massive equipment rather than thought. And this brought with it the eroticism of working with a real hands-on guy, the army engineer from the West Midlands, whom Turing worked closely with on building the Scrambler. It was for speech secrecy, but Alan Turing's speech was not secret at all, and he was much more positive about his gay identity from this time onwards. And indeed, it looks as though he discovered more possibilities for adventure outside his upper middle class status. But in July 1945, he was in Paris, spending a week hanging around, waiting for transports to Germany, where a party were going to inspect captured German cipher and communication material. And I suspect this was when he had a Keynesian experience, discovering the possibilities on Parisian streets, and from then on, Europe signaled sexual liberation. This speech scrambler had another purpose. It was a dry run for Turing for learning electronics and then planning an electronic version of his universal machine. In other words, an electronic computer of the kind we are now has changed our world. In this, he had a formidable rival, John von Neumann, the Hungarian mathematician, who had got to know Turing as early as 1935, offered him that Princeton postdoc in 1938, and who is generally credited with the first electronic computer design in 1945. Now, this is not a computer history talk, but I will mention for those interested that there is newly discovered evidence, not yet published, that makes it more clear than ever that von Neumann was fully aware of Turing's universal machine concept when he produced that design. But in any case, the point is that rivalry between the US and the UK drove this story. The competition was productive. It was news from the US that prompted the start of a project at the National Physical Laboratory in southwest London, and that's where Turing was appointed in October 1945 to design a computer. Turing made very little of his claim to the origin of the computer. He was very self-effacing. He tended to be self-effacing and then not like the fact that he'd been effaced. He probably made a mistake in getting so involved in the physical design and engineering, something he could not actually carry out himself. But a more subtle point is that he'd rather failed to build on the vision of the future software industry that he undoubtedly had in 1946, years ahead of anyone else in seeing the scope of computing. If he had written the serious papers and books that he had in him at that point, rather than scraps and reports and so forth, he could have asserted a much more lasting claim to the whole origin of computer science. He did this, he skipped this and jumped ahead to promote the prospects for artificial intelligence. There was public interest from the very start of computers in the idea of artificial intelligence, with the expression electronic brain in all the newspapers. Turing happily used it, to the great disapproval of other people who kept on saying that a computer was merely calculating and so forth. So Charles Darwin, who was chief of the National Physical Laboratory, explained to the public that they were now going to make Turing's 1936 dream come true, but reassured the intelligentsia that it would only be the lower functions of the brain that a machine could emulate. Well, that wasn't Turing's idea at all. I mean, he never talked like that. In the post-war period, Turing made a very serious pitch to the effect that the simulation of mind would include everything, and he meant this seriously. Mathematics, chess, and cryptanalysis suggested, but also, as he put it, sex, sport, and other things of interest to the average human being. The conjunction of sex and sport was actually quite a revealing conjunction. He spent enormous amounts of weeknights and Saturdays in 1946 and 47 on amateur running, and I would guess it's fair to say that questions of youth, masculinity, fitness, contact with other young men must have been of absorbing importance to him in this period in a way that you can't tell from texts, but it was very much part of his physical life. This was Alan Turing on the left, just getting on the bus to a race meeting, and that's him racing. It had some funny consequences once they went out to the West End for a Beano after a race meeting and ended up at the striptease club, which the other lads were all agog at, but noticed Alan Turing fast asleep, which might have been a bit of a clue, I guess. Anyway, I think they just thought he was such a brain that he would be above such things, but he was not. Not that, anyway. In 1948, back at Cambridge, much more confident than before the war, Alan Turing did make new and lasting gay friends, and also a math student from Newcastle, Neville Johnson, who became an ordinary boyfriend at last. And in fact, a very nice summer cycling holiday in France, where they visited the Lascaux caves. But this relationship did not become permanent, which is another of these pieces of things which are really, could have been otherwise, could have made a great difference into his whole life if they'd been otherwise. A great shame. And one problem was that Neville was too overawed by mathematical seriousness, but more mundanely, Neville got a job with Plessis in Reading, while Turing went off to Manchester, and it was difficult to sustain a relationship over 150 miles, though for some time Neville went to stay at weekends. Now, why Manchester? Well, Turing got fed up with slow progress at the National Physical Laboratory and jumped ship. And this is a long story, but his universal machine principle had been implemented at Manchester in a completely different way and was working in June 1948. He was lured by that magnetic prospect of seeing it actually physically done. Probably a mistake. The project was dominated by the top radar engineers who had very ingeniously got it working ahead of the Americans and everyone else, and they had scooped the contract to develop it for the British atomic bomb calculation. Any ideas that Alan Turing had would be very secondary to this. But he went, and moving to Manchester meant a great change of scene up to the very blackened industrial north. There was an obvious culture clash, but Manchester, should be remembered, had great scientific distinction, and the radio astronomy, for instance, was very famous of beginning in just that period, as well as the computer. Patrick Blackett, who was a Nobel Physics Prize winner and another former King's Fellow, was a huge figure. Max Newman, as the new professor of pure mathematics at Manchester, and played a big part in Turing's career since 1935, he'd enticed him to Manchester, again, a very much a top-level Cambridge figure. All the same, the dominant Manchester mentality was reflected its history of making things, and the new worlds of hardware and software had to fit into that. And I mention these stereotypes to make the obvious point that if we're talking about gender and sexuality, the associations go far beyond the actual allocation and perception of what male and female people do. There are real Manchester was, well, it was for real men. Turing didn't really fit in. You might say his world was one of virtual womanchester. And as it happened, of course, the Manchester environment also saw that major change of the post-war period, with women taking new and more prominent roles. And Turing supervised some master's-level women students who did notable work in software writing. And there was also a woman friend who became a trusted confidant, the Bloomsbury writer Lynn Irvin, who had married Max Newman but led a very independent life. Alan Turing There we see him at the console of the machine as built in 1951, and tellingly, he's on the edge. He's being edged out, in fact. He's now just a user of the machine. The machine is his idea, but the people in charge are the engineers who have built it. And, he reconciles himself to that, and he reconciles himself to Manchester. In fact, he seems he really quite liked getting away from an elite world and being, well, more ordinary. So he stuck with it, despite the fact that his software work was uninspired. A very significant fact is that he turned down a good offer from MIT, which could have led to a totally different American future. In fact, he brushed this off immediately. But there was, I think, a method in this madness. He had great academic freedom at Manchester. There was the freedom to pursue whatever he wanted to do in research. And in 1950, he turned to completely new work in mathematical biology, a completely different connection of thought with a physical living world. And for the rest of his life, this was his major activity, and it became the foundation of what is today a huge area of applied mathematics. Nevertheless, the year 1950 saw Turing's best-known work in artificial intelligence, which is the philosophical paper entitled Computing Machinery Intelligence. And I think I'm going to I just mentioned, let me say, it's a very serious paper. It's founded on his own analysis of computability and the idea of the universal machine. But it's very different from other papers of this period. It delights readers by taking intelligence to include wit and humor and sensitivity. The humor has a mildly risque element, emphasized by introduction, which makes an irrelevant but highly suggestive game out of testing via text messages, not for intelligence but for gender. And it's odd how close to the bone these guessing questions are for sex chat line addicts today. Turing seems to have seen something of the future pull of computer-human interaction. And this was something which was in the air at Manchester generally, where the very chaotic computer installation, with no one really dictating how it was used, allowed for variegated flowers to blossom. It was for the atomic bomb, but it was also for the gender-free love letters generated by a program written by Christopher Strachey, who's another interesting figure. He was Alan Turing's software disciple, another Bloomsbury product. In fact, I might mention that Christopher Strachey also had the Maynard Keynes lunch experience later in 1935 as an 18-year-old new undergraduate. Glasses and bad teeth, reported Keynes to Lydia. Typical Strachey, no doubt comparing him with his uncle, his former lover, Lytton Strachey. Anyway, Strachey, from that background, would not surprise you in knowing that he got the universal machine to show that he could play tunes. And the computer multimedia world was foreshadowed in this Manchester environment more than anywhere else at the time. Tim Berners-Lee has described the stimulus of his early upbringing in this environment. And you can see that Turing's idea of judging intelligence by a jury rather than by an expert is a sort of openness and modernness which is more like today's world than the world of the 1950s. Well, Turing also, many topics in this paper. One of those is how intelligence can be distinguished from truth-telling. And in 1933, Turing saw a production of Bernard Shaw's Back to Methuselah, which he thought a very good play, though no one else did. I think Shaw had a discussion of an imaginary artificial intelligence back then, in which he put truth-telling at the core. Turing's 1936 work actually proves that truth-telling cannot be reduced to algorithms. And it's odd to hear people say nowadays about the question of whether there's an algorithm for truth in postings on social media. This is actually where computers all started, back in 1936. Now, Turing had an argument in 1950 for why this didn't matter, but not everyone accepts this. And over the last 30 years, Roger Penrose has addressed this question and linked it with another thing that Turing nearly got to raising, almost did, the quantum mechanical nature of the brain, something he could very well have returned to. And in my view, this is where Alan Turing would have taken Penrose's arguments extremely seriously, but this is not a question for this talk. Where I'm going to go on to is the fact that truth-telling, trust, integrity, those are the concepts, rather than intelligence, which go to the heart of the disaster which struck Alan Turing through his arrest and trial as a homosexual in 1952. Now, again, there are elements of luck and bad luck in this. Just north of the university lay the north of England's gay men's tramping ground, and you could not possibly have missed the scent of adventure. And from 1950, as Neville faded out, he was tempted to hang around. And it was bad luck. There were others who might have been a better choice. But in November 1951, he tried up the chat line, "I work on the electronic brain," on 19-year-old Arnold, a dreamy lost boy from Wythenshawe, and invited the lad to his home in Wilmslow. Well, there were 3 meetings. It's a classic thing that happened. Arnold boasted to his mates about seeing a posh gent. Alan's house was burgled. He discovered the burglary on coming back from a BBC radio discussion of artificial intelligence. And it was bad luck. He said he had reckoned it as a 1 in 10 chance. Maynard Keynes had been lucky with his adventures, and Alan Turing was not. He took it immediately as tantamount to blackmail and determined to stand up to it. He told a white lie to the police, but it didn't work. They arrested him for the crimes defined by the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, just the same as Oscar Wilde, the same as hundreds and thousands of other men. The arrest actually fell on the day George VI died and marked the beginning of Her Majesty's new reign. Turing's immediate comment to the police was that he thought there was a royal commission sitting to legalize it. It's hard to know where he'd got that idea. In 1948, Anthony Crosland, a young Labour figure, had suggested reform, but Attlee was so shocked that he suppressed even the mention of it. There was faint modernism stirring. After all, freedom had been a war slogan, and Turing embodied that sense of modernism. And what happened in practice was that the Tory crackdown in 1952 to 54 defeated itself by making the whole subject a public issue and eventually bringing about change. Turing's statement to the police was this mixture of explicitness and sensitivity that I've mentioned before. Yes, it was explicit. He used the expression "soixante-neuf," which was not familiar to the policemen. It wasn't what they expected at all. Was it like the Kinsey report, all about physical behavior? No, it was not. It was about trust, awareness, and truth. The trial was at Knutsford in Cheshire on the 31st of March 1952, and as everyone now knows, he was put on probation for a year with the condition of accepting treatment with an estrogen implant supposed to neutralize his sexual interest. This was a soft option. It was not Oscar Wilde's hard labor. This was meant to be the modern scientific approach, and it was the one change of the Attlee government in 1948 that affected this. It allowed crime to be treated as mental illness. Turing's modernism came out in a rather different way in a short story in which he fictionalized the fateful pickup. Again, explicit but nuanced. It's notable for treating the working-class lad on equal footing and seeing him himself through those eyes, surprising in his use of the new American expression "gay man," and breaking off tellingly with a sentence about doing or not doing the right thing, which goes to the heart of his situation. Anyway, Turing stood up to the whole of the taboo and persecution of the period, no doubt with a fortification helped by his background here at Cambridge. And he spoke freely and unashamed by the trial in the Manchester environment. And yet he died. And so in the last part of the talk, I will discuss some new evidence now in the archive which sheds light on this last period of his life. The dates are important. He died at home in his bed of potassium cyanide poisoning on the evening of Monday, the 7th of June, 1954. This came more than 2 years after he had stood trial. The verdict was suicide. There were pieces of apple by his side, and it was assumed, no reason to suppose incorrectly, that the apple had been dipped in the cyanide solution and eaten. His mother, Sarah Turing, held and published a book to say that it was an accident, that her impractical son had carelessly got the cyanide onto his fingers while conducting a home chemistry experiment which used that solution for gold electroplating. And indeed, the electrolytic experiment was there in his spare room. There was no mystery also about him having cyanide. An Australian chemistry postdoc called Noel Hush had seen him take chemicals ad lib from the chemistry department in those pre-health and safety days. Now, of course, public assumptions have changed so much since the 1950s. In those days, it was unthinkable to mention in public that he was gay and being prosecuted. So most people were willing to believe her story to explain a death that by her account came completely out of the blue when he had nothing in the world to worry about and everything to live for. Now, Sarah Turing did know far more than she let on, but I think she had genuinely convinced herself that the trial, then over 2 years in the past, had nothing to do with it. She had a point, and other people have made it too. But this argument overlooks the fact that the consequences of the prosecution were not finished with in March 1952. In fact, they were just beginning. And also, the sexuality isn't something that just goes back in the box after this episode. He was living with it every day thereafter. Now, after that, in the 60s and 70s, let's say, a lot of people connected through mathematics or computing or Cambridge did hear something of the prosecution whispered on the grapevine. For them, it was far too easy to make the opposite assumptions. He was homosexual. That's why. So, of course, it was suicide. That's the answer. And that, too, has its point. The event was extremely traumatic and changed his life. But that overlooks the fact that Turing's reaction was not one of wilting shame, but defiance, resistance. And a prime example of this, that the first thing he did in summer 1952 was to go to Norway. Somehow he had caught wind of the early Scandinavian gay rights movement of 1948 and the fact that it arranged social events. Well, nowadays, the world's caught up with that sort of modernism. He was 20 years ahead, and the pendulum has swung the other way. People just like to think, well, he was upfront, unapologetic gay man, and the association with suicide reflects a completely out-of-date homophobic prejudice. It must have been an accident after all. But the problem with this is that upfront as he was, another key step he took was to see and take very seriously a psychoanalyst, specifically to resolve what he called the problem. I'll come to this. Anyway, the point was he was far from being totally assured and carefree. Well, that's the background, and my judgment remains that it was a suicide that he carefully planned, mainly for his mother's benefit, as a death that could be believed to be an accident. The gold plating and the apple were props, carefully staged for this sensitive purpose. One thing that supports this premeditation is the will that he signed in February 1954. He was only 41, he was never ill, so writing a will was unusual anyway, but this will was absolutely extraordinary. It cut out his lawyer brother, who would have been the natural executor for the family, and divided his estate between 5, identifiable between those most supportive of him as a gay man. And those are, I've listed the names there. So, notably, his mother counts as one of the 5, and not by virtue of being his mother and in the family. It was one of his friends. The executor was the shy, young gay man Nick Furbank, later a well-known literary figure and biographer of E.M. Forster, and of course, whom he'd met here at King's College in 1948. Now, Nick Furbank never released the letters that he'd had from Alan Turing and only hinted at their content to me. Since his death, they have come to the college archive, and you may have seen one of them in the exhibition. The first of these shows that Turing started planning his will soon after the trial and pressed Nick to be the executor then. In particular, he indicated that it was necessary in case he was in trouble again. Well, actually, he used the French expression malheur, in case there's malheur, as he nicely cushioned this very disturbing request by writing his letter in French. Nick eventually agreed to take on this duty, and it was quite clear about how Alan had been talking about suicide. So at least you can say he was preparing for the possibility of an early death if there was trouble again. And there was. By March 1953, he was indeed in fresh trouble. This is what he called a crisis when a young man he chatted up in Norway sent a postcard saying he was visit. He was intercepted by police before he reached Manchester. Turing was very upset by this episode and considered it as serious as the trial, but it was rather mysterious. March 1953 was also exactly when he reported starting up his home chemistry lab. And in my view, he was simply preparing the suicide plan as something that could be ready to go even when he chose. I can now be more sure there was such a plan because in 1954, his boyfriend Neville Johnson wrote to Nick Furbank about the death, and this letter now is also in the archive. Neville said that Alan had told him once how as a young man he had formulated a suicide plan. Not just depressed and suicidal, but had formulated a plan. Neville did not know what it involved, but I do, because James Atkins, Alan's pre-war boyfriend, whom I spoke of, told me of a gloomy letter he'd had from Alan away in Princeton in 1937 that mentioned a suicide plan somehow involving an apple and electrical wiring, as it was completely mystifying, but indeed it did. He might well have been depressed and thinking of a suicide in 1937 in reasons I've described. And also we know that his mother had feared he might do himself harm. This is clear from another letter now revealed that she sent to the dean at Princeton behind Alan's back when he went there in 1936. She made a great fuss about how the dean should contact the Turing family in case of an emergency. A classic helicopter parent worrying letter. And so it looks to me very clear that in 1937, Alan Turing could very well have sought to find a way to shield his mother in particular from a dreadful truth. Direct, clear, yet sensitive. He ensured in July 1953 that she saw on her annual visit this chemistry set up in his spare room, and she was duly horrified. You will be careful, won't you, dear, etc., etc. And at the same time, incidentally, he wrote to Nick Furbank a letter you may have seen in the exhibition, very typical of his chat and way of talking, that he'd been subjecting her to a good deal of sexual enlightenment, and she seems to have stood up to it very well. And that charming way of describing his mother to his gay friend, I think explains why he was able to include her as one of the 5 moral supporters named in his will. Anyway, it worked perfectly. And there's further new evidence that this dramatic plan was always in his mind. In November 1951, he was out running with his jogging partner, a 17-year-old Manchester grammar school boy called Alan Garner, later to be famous as an author of The Owl Service and other books of the 1960s. But then a schoolboy, and chatting as they ran, it emerged that both of them had been deeply struck by the famous poisoned apple of Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs, the Disney film that both of them had seen in late 1938. And Alan Garner recalls vividly how Turing discoursed on the apple as an icon of life and death. Now, what was this trouble of March 1953, a year after the trial? It was not trouble with the local police. It was a special branch, or the poor sweeties, as Alan Turing called them. It must have dawned on him at that point that he was not just one of the hundreds of gay men prosecuted for homosexual sex. He uniquely held the most closely guarded secrets of the state. Nothing about Bletchley Park emerged for another 20 years, and he had extra knowledge both from the United States in the war and also from working for GCHQ after 1948 until 1952, when that had to be terminated. In the new language of the Cold War, he was a security risk. The United States had codified this classification After 1952, no gay men were allowed in the United States federal government, and theoretically, none were even allowed entry to the United States. Turing's case must have been incredibly embarrassing for the government, especially after the 1951 defections of Burgess and Maclean, characters who came from exactly the same trusted class and Cambridge background. And at the same time as this, Alan wrote a letter to Robin Gandy, his another close confidant and mathematics graduate student, with satirical remarks about how Robin should be stopped from going abroad, obvious references to the McCarthy period at the time, describing Robin as a heretic with allegiances to the Hall of Kings. Well, here we are in the very hall. I don't imagine he could have expected that this lightly written but deeply worrying, showing great deep disturbance of his mind, would be being read out all those decades later. And that must have been what was on his mind. It was the question of the right to go abroad. Turing called classified as meaning secret a ridiculous word of American origin. In February 1953, he wrote to a cybernetics colleague trying to get him to visit to a conference in the United States, "I would not like the journey, and I detest America." So these are not expressions that would have gone down terribly well at the Foreign Office. It's not that he didn't like travel and very keen on going to Germany when he was invited by the Foreign Office to give some lectures in German universities, responded with alacrity to this and then suddenly called it off. And I suspect that what had happened is that in the light of these revelations, the Foreign Office had got very cold feet about sponsoring any such thing. Robert Hannigan, until very recently director of GCHQ, has revealed some inside information, and his statement places strong emphasis on the significance of Turing's GCHQ connection and regards his treatment as something for which GCHQ must apologize. I think this is unnecessarily apologetic. The fact is, from the point of view of anyone trying to run government, Turing's behavior was incredibly irresponsible. I mean, he was insisting on roaming Europe as a sex tourist while holding top secrets at the most paranoid point of the Cold War. I mean, he was still in the world of 1938, when no one asked questions about chaps from the right school and the right college, and when he'd been introduced through the Kens and King's connections to work with Dilwyn Knox, who'd been Turing's lover, had been Maynard Keynes's lover. I mean, this is another world, a world unknown to that of American security officials. But the thing is, I think that Alan Turing may have liked explicitness and mechanization, but he didn't like it applied to himself in an insensitive way. But there are there's another question, I think, if I still have time. Yes, I think I just released this last point to you. That there are others who suffered greatly at this time, like Robert Oppenheimer, under the cloud of security and the whole question of trust and the relationship with the state. But I think there was something else that was even more undermining of Alan Turing's own sense of identity and question of what to do and what made life worth living. And that question is this: what on earth was what he was doing seeing a psychoanalyst? What did he expect to get out of writing down and discussing all his dreams? Well, in December 1952, he told Nick, "I had a dream recently indicating rather clearly that I am on the way to being hetero, though I didn't accept it with much enthusiasm, either awake or in the dream." He said other things of this nature, more teasingly, to his friend Robin Gandy. And the dream, what was the dream? This dream was of a latent bisexuality which might break through, released by this magic of psychotherapy and working through all the things in his, perhaps in his childhood life and so forth. And I say bisexuality because he never for a moment spoke of wanting to eradicate attraction to other men. He continued all the time with outspoken, really quite outrageous comment. There was never any question of trying to get rid of something, but he did seem to think that his erotic interests could enlarge and extend. And this, come back to my beginning point, this is exactly what John Maynard Keynes had done at the same age. at the age of 40. And this was what many of his circle had done, and this is what other of Alan Turing's friends done and would encourage, though Nick Furbank, I may say, did not like the sound of this at all. And the climax of this story is something that now makes sense of his last rather extraordinary venture, which was his holiday on the Greek island of Corfu in July 1953, because we now see there was a plan for it. He wrote to Nick, "I have just been in hospital and have had my estrogen capsules out. It was really quite jolly there, and there was a fairly attractive nurse. My holiday in Corfu is now fixed up. I expect to lie in the sun, talk French and modern Greek, and make love, though the sex and nationality of the favoured ones has yet to be decided. It is in fact quite possible that this will be altogether omitted. I want a permanent relationship and might feel inclined to reject anything which of its nature would not be permanent." Well, he went to Corfu, he went to the Club Méditerranée. It was when it opened, and it was a great icon of the new Europe of the 50s. It's the sunshine emerging at last from the ghastly shadow of the Second World War and the Greek Civil War and all that. A train trip across Europe in high summer would have been a wonderful experience, but why there? Well, it's clear there was a plan. He would be a beach boy in this new liberated environment, swinging 50s, and see what happens, see if he could find this attraction not just to one sex, but to two. And I think the answer is no, it didn't. There was no chance of that happening at all. He sent a postcard to the psychiatrist's family here, in which he reported, "It is tremendously hot, and one wears bathing things all day." He was, he could be a beach boy all right, but I don't think any of these changes happened. And we can tell that because after he came back, there's not a word of this bisexuality emerging in dreams or in real people or anything at all. In fact, he dried up altogether. There are very few personal letters at all after that period. In fact, his whole correspondence is diminishing. He hunkered down on work. He was still working on the morphogenetic theory and indeed using the computer at nights on his trials. But it strikes me as strongly that this escape route from the great trap he was in of having no identity that was acceptable to his world situation, that met a complete dead end. And I think also this holiday on the edge of just where you can see Albania from Corfu, it was on the very edge of Western Europe, could well have been the very last straw for the Foreign Office. In fact, it seems quite amazing that they allowed this to happen at all. So that, I think, is when, after he'd signed his will in February 1954, it was all set to go when he chose, and he did choose. He chose at the end of the very wet and cold bank holiday of June 1954, and we've no idea what may have been the absolute trigger for it. One factor is that his mother, who was the object of the plan, was away in Italy and therefore couldn't emerge to be on the scene the next day. Another, completely different, it was the 10th anniversary of D-Day, and who really could not notice that this commemorated on The Guardian and The Observer, which were his last reading, that he would have known that he was one individual who'd done as much to make that possible as anyone and had got, one might say, very little thanks for it. And is found on the Tuesday morning, by modern standards, outrageously quickly disposed of, perfunctory inquest, cremation, all in less than a week, all gone by the Saturday, very little in the press, almost certainly denoticed, disappeared, and very largely disappeared from the scientific world until the great revivals that have taken place. And now, alive in spirit more than ever, and I think through wonderful archive in this college, leaving us a unique physical link that I hope will have made this day memorable for everyone.
Thank you, Andrew, for that wonderful talk. We're going to take some questions now. I'll be pointing to people, but be sure you wait for the microphone before you ask your question, because we're recording this. Yes, so questions. Surely there are some.
I've got one more picture, which I'd like to leave a happier image of Alan Turing as a beach boy. And that's... There is the inner Alan Turing, not so suited to be the chief figure in Anglo-American security, but on the coast of the Channel Island of Sark in summer of 1931. Mm-hmm.
Questions? Yes, there's a question there. Microphone.
Thank you. That was really a fabulous talk. Really enjoyed it. I think the suggestion you make is that he deliberately incriminated himself. Is that right? That he was making a stand of some kind? Yeah. But was that... I mean, you're convinced by that. And secondly, was he involved in anything more broad in terms of a political or other kind of stand against the law? Obviously, the campaign at that time, whatever it was probably quite muted. But I just wondered, was it just a lone voice or?
All right, so the basic story is, yes, he was a lone voice, and it was a classic case of how prosecutions of this kind, how the cases came to the notice of the police. It was through petty crime of some other kind. He, I suppose, foolishly, and people all said he was very foolish to give a statement and so forth, and he certainly gave a much more truthful statement than anyone else would have done, and was wrong if he thought that truthfulness would gain him credit. I mean, it was repentance that was wanted, not truthfulness. Arnold, the lad, had given a statement too, but of course he said, "Oh, I'm terribly sorry, this is terribly wrong what I did," and so forth, and he got off very lightly. He was treated very comparatively severely. It's hard to know exactly what he considered he was doing with this statement, but it certainly was taking a moral stand. He was absolutely clear that he felt he'd done nothing wrong. And the way he phrased himself was to that effect. And the police felt that very strongly. They'd never met anything like it. And of course, it was very convenient for them because they got a full confession, but they were very struck by him being completely different from people who usually said, "Oh, I don't know what came over me," and sort of blah, blah, blah. So he was very different. He couldn't say he campaigned, but he did tell his engineer friend Donald Bailey that he had written to an MP saying the law shouldn't be what it was, but I wasn't able to find evidence of that. So I don't know how far that went.
Another question? Okay, then let's thank Andrew again. And
dumbfounded.
Yeah.
I can't believe. Anyway.
I should say that we have refreshments back in the Chetwynd room, which is just it's sort of just beyond the toilets there. And we also have a model of the Enigma machine set up in the Keynes Hall, which is just beyond the Chetwynd room. So you're all welcome to join us for refreshments in the Chetwynd room. Let's thank Andrew again.